So in the last video, we left off with looking at statistics that shows that the participation rate in the employment sector in the United States has declined. But keep in mind, remember the participation rate, so participation rate, rate equals the labor force divided by the working age population, right? Now, in theory, you could have the labor force increasing, right? And still have the participation rate fall. That's if the population grows faster than the labor force. So in other words, if this grows faster than this, you could actually have the participation rate fall. And that's exactly what's happening in the United States. The labor force is growing, but not as fast as the population. Therefore, the participation rate is falling. Now, let's look at labor force, just the labor force growth around the world, right? And we could see that the United States, even though the participation rate is falling, the United States is showing a forecasted increase in growth in the labor force out to 2050. So this is a projection, right? But you could see, look at Japan. Japan is already showing a decline in the labor force. And by 2050, the labor force will have shrunk by 44%. And Europe is not that far behind. You can see Europe is flat until right about now, right? And then it's going to show a decline of about 25%. Now, South Korea, it's still projected to increase out to 2015, so roughly till right now. Then the growth is slowing, and then around 2025, it's going to go negative, and it's going to go negative quite rapidly and drop about 30% by 2050. Now, China is a country that you don't really associate with labor shortages, but you could see we're at 2018 right here, and you could see right now China's labor force growth has peaked, and now it is projected to start to slow, right? It's growing, but at a slower rate. And then right around 2032, labor force growth will be 0. And then it's going to start to decrease. And this is mainly due to the one-child policy enacted in 1980. So the United States is the only large economy which is projected to show an increase in the labor force growth. Now, this is a projection. A lot of things can happen, but this goes to show you that there are many parts around the world that are going to be showing labor shortages. Now, why is labor force growth important? Well, labor force growth is a key determinant in overall economic growth, because economic growth, or in other words, production growth, is limited by two factors. The availability of the factors of production, labor being one of them, and productivity, technological know-how. So if your labor force growth is falling, you're going to have to compensate it with an increase in productivity in order just to maintain your current growth rate. And if you remember in chapter 1, we kind of showed this with the production possibilities curve, right? So economic growth is represented by an expansion of the production possibilities curve, and that looks like this. So here, this is how much you could produce of good A or good B, and if you give me either more factors of production, like labor, or you make my existing factors of production more productive, I could shift the production possibilities curve outward, and this is a representation of economic growth. So let's look. So we looked at labor force as an economic indicator. We looked at the participation rate as an economic indicator. What about unemployment as an economic indicator? Well, to make full use of your available production capacity, the labor force has to be fully employed. And unemployment is simply the inability of labor to find work. Now, this is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed, so the U rate, is the number of unemployed, so unemployed, that's a number, divided by the labor force. And that's the percentage of the labor force that cannot find work. And you could see here, again, these shaded areas right here, these shaded areas represent periods of recession, right? And this is the Great Recession, what you see here, right? And you could see that we went into a recession December 2007. And you could see that's when the unemployment rate started to really climb, and it shot. So it was at a low right about here at about 4.2%, and then it peaked at 10% right here. And it took a long time to fall. Now currently we're at 3.7% unemployment, which is very low. But look how long it took to go from here, the previous low, to this low. We're talking 10 years to recover from this recession that you see right here. So that means this was a rather steep recession in terms of economic downturn, and it took a long time to recover. Now, we could actually put a price tag on unemployment. There's something called Okun's Law. Now, Okun's Law basically states that for every 1% increase in the unemployment rate, it's estimated to equal 2% output. Now keep in mind, GDP is output, a measurement of output, GDP, I'm sorry. And this is a value measurement. So if you have a $17 trillion economy and your unemployment rate drops 1%, well, if you take 2% of this, you could put a dollar figure on that increase in unemployment. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau, now keep in mind, the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes the unemployment rate, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses the Census Bureau's survey of about 60,000 households to determine how many people are actually employed. They do this every month. Now, a person is considered unemployed if he or she is not employed and is still actively seeking a job. So the unemployment rate, like I said before, is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So if I gave you, this is a nice little hint for the upcoming quiz. If I gave you the number of unemployed, the number of employed, the number of unemployed, and the people not in the labor force, you should be able to calculate the unemployment rate. So how would you do this? Well, the labor force is all the people working and the people looking for work. And in that previous table, as you could see, the employed here is 145.9. The unemployed here is 8.5. So if I add those two numbers together, this is the labor force. Now the unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. And you could see the unemployed is 8.5. The labor force is 154.4. So this divided by this multiplied by 100 gives you an unemployment rate of 5.5%. Now, the unemployment rate is a national number, but it doesn't break down the unemployment rate by region or by demographics. So what if you broke it down by sex, gender? You could see that unemployment differs. Now and you could also break it down by race, right? And you could see that this gives you a more detailed understanding of the nature of unemployment when you start breaking it down by demographics. And look at teenagers. Teenagers have a much higher unemployment rate than adults. What about education? Well, this is a very big difference. So this is 2017. The national average for 2017 was 4.4%. Well, those with less than a high school education had a much higher unemployment rate than the national average, right? But then when you get a little more education, a high school diploma, you see the unemployment rate drops. A little more education, some college, but not a degree, it drops even further. If you have an associate's degree, a 2-year degree, it drops even further. Those with a bachelor's, it drops even further. And those with a master's or maybe a PhD, it drops even more. So it goes to show you that the more education and training that you get, the more positive benefits that you see in the labor force. Now, another big underreported indicator for the employment sector is the duration of unemployment. In other words, what's the typical time it takes somebody to find work? So when the economy is growing, both the unemployment rates and the average duration of unemployment declines, which makes sense, right? And you could see here we have this measured in weeks, right? And you could see during the 2000s, it took you roughly somewhere between 20 weeks and 15 weeks on average for you to find a job. So you lose your job, the average person found a job between 15 and 20 weeks, right? So we're talking about, 3 months it took them to find work. But then the recession starts here, and you could see it takes people longer and longer, and then it peaks. Look at this. This is the average. It took people on average 40 weeks to find work. That means some people were looking for work for more than a year. And then, even though the recession ended here in December 2009, people start to find work faster, but still the fall in the average time it takes somebody to find work took a long time to get. Now it's currently at 21.7 weeks. Still not what it was here in the 2000s, right? And we could break this down even further. Here we see that in November 2018, 35% of the people unemployed found work less than 5 weeks. And there was an unfortunate few, 21% of the unemployed took over 27 weeks to find work. So you could see how we could really break down employment in different indicators here. So that's all for now, and we're going to close out the lecture with the next video and talk more about employment.